They laughed at the disheveled pianist the moment his trembling hands touched the keys at the Richardson-Campbell wedding. The once white dress shirt, now yellowed with age and poorly ironed, hung loose on his thin frame as he hunched over the grand piano. His worn shoes were scuffed beyond repair, and a faded tie, clearly from another decade, hung awkwardly around his neck. The wealthy guests in their designer attire exchanged glances, some whispering behind champagne flutes, others not even bothering to hide their disdain. "Is this really the best they could afford?" one guest snickered to another, loud enough for the front tables to hear. The father of the bride shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact with his country club friends. The wedding coordinator was frantically flipping through her clipboard, clearly wondering how this man had been approved for such a prestigious event at the Bellamy Hotel's grand ballroom. Would you have stood up for him, or joined the crowd looking away? Tell us in the comments. But no one in that room full of silk dresses and Italian suits was ready for what happened next. The widowed father of three closed his eyes, took a deep breath that lifted his narrow shoulders, and positioned his weathered hands over the keys. For a brief moment, everything went silent, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Then his fingers began to move. The first notes floated across the room like whispers from another world. Gone was the awkward, shuffling man who had taken his seat moments before. In his place sat a maestro whose fingers danced across the ivory with the grace and precision of someone who had dedicated his life to this instrument. The melody that emerged wasn't the standard wedding repertoire everyone expected. It was something hauntingly beautiful, something original. And if stories of fathers who refuse to give up move you, subscribe now. More powerful stories every week. The guests who had been snickering fell silent, their champagne glasses frozen midway to their lips. The bride, who had been anxiously waiting for her cue to enter, felt tears welling in her eyes, though she couldn't explain why. Something about the music reached beyond the ornate decorations and expensive flowers to touch something raw and real in the atmosphere. No one knew that Thomas Mercer had once been considered a musical prodigy, that he had studied at Juilliard before life intervened with its unexpected cruelties. No one knew that 15 years ago he had composed this very piece for his wife's 25th birthday, the last birthday she would ever celebrate before cancer took her away from him and their 3 young children. The wedding coordinator stopped her frantic searching and simply stood still, captivated like everyone else. The father of the bride looked up from his embarrassment, suddenly curious about the man he had hired on a tight budget after the original pianist canceled last minute. Thomas had not touched a piano professionally in nearly a decade. After Sarah died, the music within him seemed to die too. He took whatever jobs he could find, night shifts at the factory, weekend work as a janitor, anything to keep his children fed and housed. His oldest son was now in college on a hard-won scholarship, his daughter in her final year of high school, and his youngest son just entering middle school. The only consistent thing in their tumultuous life had been their father's unwavering devotion. When the call came about this wedding gig, Thomas had almost declined. His hands were rough from manual labor now, his skills rusty from disuse. But his youngest son's birthday was approaching, and the boy had been eyeing a telescope in the shop window downtown for months. So Thomas had pulled his old suit from the back of the closet, ironed it as best he could, and accepted the job. What the guests couldn't see as he played were the memories flooding through him. Teaching Sarah to dance in their tiny apartment kitchen, her laughter as he composed silly tunes about her cooking, the way she would rest her head on his shoulder during the quiet moments when he played just for her. This piece, her piece, had never been played for anyone else until today. As the melody built toward its crescendo, Thomas opened his eyes, and for a moment he faltered. Sitting in the front row was a young woman in her 20s, with long dark hair cascading over her shoulders and bright eyes that seemed to see right through him. She looked so much like Sarah that his heart constricted painfully in his chest. But he didn't stop playing. His fingers found their way back to the melody, as they always had, even through the grief that sometimes threatened to swallow him whole. The wedding party had been instructed to enter at precisely the right musical cue, but the coordinator made no move to signal them. No one wanted to interrupt what was happening in that room. This unexpected moment of pure beauty arising from the most unlikely source. In the second row, an older gentleman with silver hair and a precisely tailored suit leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. Maxwell Thornton had spent 40 years as the director of the City Symphony, and he recognized exceptional talent when he heard it. He pulled out his phone discreetly, opened the recording app, and placed it on the table, his eyes never leaving the pianist. When Thomas finally brought the piece to its gentle conclusion, the room remained in perfect silence for 3 heartbeats. Then, as if a spell had been broken, applause erupted, not the polite, obligatory kind, but thunderous appreciation that rose from something genuine. The same guests who had mocked him minutes earlier were now on their feet. Thomas blinked in surprise, a flush creeping up his neck. This wasn't part of the plan. He was supposed to play background music, to be invisible. He quickly shuffled his sheet music, embarrassed by the attention, and began a traditional wedding march for the bride's entrance. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of that ballroom. The guests who had been mentally calculating each other's net worth now exchanged glances of shared appreciation. The bride, when she finally entered, walked down the aisle with tears streaming freely down her face, moved by music that had somehow made her feel the weight and beauty of the commitment she was about to make. What no one realized was that the day's events had only just begun to unfold in unexpected ways. During the reception, while Thomas played softly in the background, Maxwell Thornton approached the piano during a brief pause between songs. "That opening piece," he said without introduction. "Was it Rachmaninoff? Chopin? I don't recognize it." Thomas shook his head, his fingers nervously straightening his worn sheet music. "It's nothing, sir, just something I wrote a long time ago." Maxwell's eyebrows shot up. "You composed that?" He extended his hand. "Maxwell Thornton. I direct the City Symphony." Thomas stared at the hand, then at the man's face. Recognition dawning. He wiped his palm on his pants before shaking the offered hand. "Thomas Mercer, sir. It's an honor." "The honor is mine. I haven't heard original composition of that caliber in years." Maxwell glanced around the reception, then back at Thomas. "Would you play it again? The whole piece this time?" Thomas hesitated, looking at the wedding coordinator, who was now frantically waving at him to continue the scheduled playlist. "I'm not sure that would be appropriate." "I'm here to play what they've requested." Maxwell nodded thoughtfully, then reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "Call me tomorrow. I'd like to discuss your music further." He placed the card on the piano and walked away before Thomas could respond. The pianist stared at the small rectangle of heavy cardstock as if it might disappear. His hand trembled slightly as he picked it up and tucked it into his breast pocket. The daughter of the bride watched this exchange with curious eyes. 16-year-old Lily had been dragged to this wedding against her will, forced into an uncomfortable dress, and told to at least pretend to be happy for her new stepsister. She had been sulking in the corner, playing games on her phone, when the music started. Something about it had made her look up, had reached into the hard shell of teenage cynicism she'd carefully constructed. When dinner was served, Thomas was directed to a small table in the back corner, separate from the guests. As he picked at his meal, he felt a presence beside him and looked up to see Lily standing there, still clutching her phone. "That song you played at the beginning," she said without preamble, "did you really write it?" Thomas nodded, surprised by the direct question. "Can you teach me to play like that?" Her voice held a challenge, as if daring him to dismiss her. "It takes years of practice," he began. "I have time," she interrupted, "and I need—" She trailed off, looking away. "Need what?" Thomas asked gently. "Something that's mine, something real." She glanced back at her table, where her mother was laughing with her new husband. "Everything's changing, and I hate it all." Thomas recognized the pain in her eyes, the same he'd seen in his own children's faces as they navigated life without their mother. Before he could respond, Lily's mother called her back to the table. and the girl left with a last lingering look. As the evening progressed, Thomas continued playing the requested songs, but his mind was elsewhere, on the business card in his pocket, on his children waiting at home, on Sarah and the piece he'd played for her. He didn't notice the father of the bride approaching until the man cleared his throat. "Mr. Mercer," Richard Campbell said, his voice carrying the slight slur of champagne, "I owe you an apology." Thomas looked up, confused. "I hired you because you were available last minute and within budget. When you walked in, I was—" he paused, embarrassed. "I was concerned about appearances. But what you played, my daughter says it was the most beautiful moment of her wedding." Thomas didn't know how to respond to this unexpected honesty. "She asked me to give you this." Richard handed him an envelope, a bonus, and her thanks. After Richard walked away, Thomas carefully opened the envelope and nearly gasped at the check inside. It was more than he'd make in 2 months at the factory. With this, he could buy Jason's telescope, catch up on the electric bill, and maybe even put something aside for Emma's college applications next year. As the reception wound down and guests began to leave, Thomas felt a strange mix of emotions. This day that had begun with humiliation had somehow transformed into something else entirely. He gathered his sheet music, nodding politely to the few guests who stopped to compliment him. Would you have the courage to play your heart's most precious memory for a room full of strangers? Let us know in the comments. Just as he was closing the piano lid, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find the bride herself standing there, still radiant in her gown despite the long day. "Mr. Mercer," she said softly, "my father told me about your situation, about your children." Thomas stiffened, pride rising in his chest. He didn't want pity, especially not today. "I teach music at Westridge Academy," she continued, seemingly unaware of his discomfort. "We have a scholarship program for talented young musicians, if any of your children are interested." "My youngest," Thomas said before he could stop himself. "Jason. He plays, not professionally, but he has a good ear." She smiled. "Bring him to the school on Monday. We'll set up an audition." As Thomas drove home that night in his old car that protested with every mile, his mind was spinning with possibilities that hadn't existed that morning. The business card from Maxwell Thornton seemed to burn in his pocket. The check from the bride's father was safely tucked into his wallet. And for the first time in years, he felt an itch in his fingers to sit at a piano and compose. He hadn't written a new piece since Sarah died. The music had died with her, or so he thought. But today, playing her song in that beautiful ballroom, something had awakened inside him, something he had believed was gone forever. When he arrived home, the babysitter was dozing on the couch. His youngest son, Jason, was still awake, waiting up despite the late hour. "Did you play good, Dad?" the 12-year-old asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Thomas ruffled his son's hair, so similar to Sarah's in color and texture. "I think I did, buddy. I think I really did." After paying the babysitter and checking on his sleeping middle child, Thomas sat on the edge of Jason's bed as the boy drifted off to sleep. He hummed softly, the beginning of a new melody forming in his mind. The next morning, Thomas woke early despite the late night. For the first time in years, he felt an urgency that had nothing to do with bills or work schedules. He made breakfast for Jason and Emma. His oldest, Michael, was away at college, then excused himself to make a phone call from the privacy of the back porch. His hand trembled as he dialed the number on Maxwell Thornton's card. "Thornton speaking," came the crisp answer. "Mr. Thornton, this is Thomas Mercer, the pianist from yesterday's wedding." "Thomas, I was hoping you'd call. That piece you played, I haven't been able to get it out of my head." Thomas swallowed hard. "Thank you, sir. Do you have more compositions? A portfolio, perhaps?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. A portfolio? Of course, a real composer would have a portfolio. "No, sir. Just a few pieces I wrote years ago. For my wife." There was a pause on the line. "Your wife must be very proud." "She passed away 15 years ago." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm sorry to hear that, Thomas. Truly." Thomas gripped the phone tighter. "The piece you heard, it was hers. I wrote it for her birthday." "And you haven't written since?" "No." Maxwell's sigh carried through the phone. "That's a terrible waste of talent, but perhaps understandable." There was the sound of papers shuffling. "The symphony is hosting a showcase of local composers next month. Nothing grand, just an evening of original works performed by our musicians. I'd like to include your piece." Thomas nearly dropped the phone. "Sir, I don't have it written down. I just play it from memory." "Then write it down," Maxwell said simply, as if he were suggesting Thomas tie his shoes. "And while you're at it, consider writing something new. The showcase accepts works up to 10 minutes in length. Your choice of arrangement." Before Thomas could formulate a response, Emma appeared at the porch door. "Dad, there's someone here to see you." Confused, Thomas said a quick goodbye to Maxwell and went to the front door. Standing on his worn welcome mat was Lily, the teenager from the wedding, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "How did you find my address?" Thomas asked, bewildered. "My stepsister, the bride, she had it in her files." Lily clutched the straps of her backpack. "You said it takes years to learn to play like you do. I figured I should get started right away." Thomas blinked in surprise. "I don't teach." "I can pay," she interrupted, pulling out a small wad of cash from her pocket. "It's not much, but it's all my birthday money." Emma appeared beside her father, curiosity evident on her face. At 17, she was just a year older than Lily, but they couldn't have looked more different. Emma with her practical ponytail and sensible clothes, Lily with her fashionable outfit and carefully applied makeup. "Dad's an amazing teacher," Emma said, extending her hand to Lily. "I'm Emma. Do you want some breakfast?" "Dad made pancakes." Lily looked uncertain, but the genuine warmth in Emma's voice seemed to reassure her. She followed them into the modest house, her eyes widening as she took in the cramped living room dominated by an old upright piano covered in sheet music and family photos. "Is this where you practice?" she asked Thomas, running her fingers reverently over the piano's worn keys. "It's where we live," Emma answered for him with a small laugh. "The piano was Mom's. Dad taught all of us to play." As Jason emerged from his room, curious about their visitor, Thomas watched his children interact with this stranger who had appeared on their doorstep. There was an ease to their conversation that surprised him. Perhaps because Emma and Jason had long ago learned not to judge others by appearances or possessions. That Sunday morning stretched into afternoon, as Thomas found himself giving Lily her first piano lesson, with Emma and Jason offering encouragement. When Lily finally left, promising to return the next day after school, Thomas sat alone at the piano, staring at the blank sheet music before him. "Write it down," Maxwell had said, as if it were that simple. But perhaps it was. Note by note, measure by measure, Thomas began to transcribe the piece he had carried in his heart for 15 years. And when that was done, his pencil hovered over a fresh sheet. "Something new," Maxwell had suggested. Thomas closed his eyes and let his fingers find the keys. The melody that emerged was different from Sarah's song, less wistful, more complex. It spoke of grief, yes, but also of resilience, of 3 children growing up without their mother, of a father learning to be both parents, of struggles and small triumphs, and a love that continued even after death. When he opened his eyes, Emma was standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "That's us," she whispered. "You're writing about us." Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "Mom would love it," Emma said, crossing the room to sit beside him on the bench. She rested her head on his shoulder, just as Sarah used to do. "Keep going, Dad. I want to hear the rest." Monday arrived with a flurry of activity. Thomas called in sick to the factory for the first time in years, using the wedding payment to justify the lost day's wages. He took Jason to Westridge Academy, where the boy's natural talent impressed the instructors despite his lack of formal training. By afternoon, Jason had been accepted into the scholarship program, which included not only music lessons but also academic support. The days that followed took on a new rhythm. Thomas continued working at the factory, but his evenings were now filled with music. teaching Lily, helping Jason prepare for his new program, and composing his new piece for the showcase. Emma would sit quietly doing her homework as they practiced, occasionally offering suggestions or encouragement. 2 weeks after the wedding, Thomas received another unexpected visitor. Maxwell Thornton arrived unannounced, his luxury car looking out of place on the humble street. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," the older man said as Thomas ushered him into the living room. "I was curious about your progress." Thomas nervously showed him the handwritten score of his new composition, still incomplete and marked with erasures and revisions. Maxwell studied the pages with intense concentration, occasionally humming phrases under his breath. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. "It's not finished," Thomas said quickly, "and I'm sure it needs professional arrangements." "It's extraordinary," Maxwell interrupted. "Raw in places, certainly, but the emotion, it's palpable." He set the score down carefully. "Thomas, I'd like to offer you a position." "A position?" "The symphony's regular pianist is retiring at the end of the season. We need someone with your level of skill and interpretive ability. The salary is modest by professional standards, but it includes benefits, health insurance, pension." Thomas stared at him in disbelief. "Mr. Thornton, I haven't performed professionally in over 15 years. I've been working in a factory. And yet, you played like that at the wedding." Maxwell leaned forward. "Talent like yours doesn't disappear, Thomas. It might hibernate, but it's still there, waiting to be awakened." That evening, after Maxwell left, Thomas sat his children down to discuss this unexpected offer. It would mean a significant pay cut initially, but the regular hours and benefits would provide a stability they'd never known. "Do it, Dad," Michael said over the phone when Thomas called him at college. "Mom would kick your butt if you didn't." Emma and Jason nodded in agreement, their faces alight with excitement for their father. The weeks leading up to the showcase were a blur of activity. Thomas continued working at the factory while preparing for his performance, often practicing late into the night after his children were asleep. Lily came for lessons 3 times a week, her natural talent flourishing under Thomas's guidance. And slowly, the new composition took shape, a symphony of family, loss, and redemption that Thomas titled simply, "After Sarah." The night of the showcase arrived with a nervous energy that permeated the Mercer household. Emma helped her father with his tie, a new one purchased for the occasion. Jason polished his dress shoes until they gleamed, and when a knock came at the door, they were surprised to find Lily's entire family, including the bride from the wedding and her new husband, waiting to drive them to the concert hall. "We wouldn't miss it," the bride said, smiling warmly at the family's shocked expressions. "Lily hasn't stopped talking about her amazing piano teacher for weeks." The concert hall was intimidating in its grandeur, so different from the upright piano in their living room where Thomas had practiced. Backstage, he peeked through the curtains at the audience filling the seats. His children were in the front row, along with Lily and her family. And there, in the center of the 3rd row, was a seat left conspicuously empty, Sarah's seat, though only Thomas knew it. As he waited for his turn to perform, Thomas felt a strange calm settle over him. He had come full circle, in a way. The journey that began with playing Sarah's song at the wedding had led him back to where he was always meant to be. When Maxwell announced him as a remarkable new voice in composition, Thomas walked onto the stage with his head held high. Gone was the disheveled pianist who had been mocked at the wedding. In his place stood a man who had found his way back to himself. He took his seat at the grand piano, adjusted the microphone, and spoke for the first time to the hushed audience. 15 years ago, I wrote a piece for my wife's birthday. It was the last music she ever heard me play before cancer took her from me and our 3 children. His voice remained steady, though he could see Emma wiping tears from her eyes in the front row. I stopped composing after she died, until recently when a wedding gig and a room full of strangers reminded me that music doesn't die, even when we think it has. Thomas positioned his hands over the keys. This piece is called After Sarah. It's for my children, who have grown up in the shadow of loss but never let it define them. And it's for anyone who has ever had to find their way back to themselves after losing their way. The first notes filled the concert hall, tentative at first, like a question asked in darkness. Then building, gaining confidence, interweaving themes of grief and joy, struggle and triumph. Thomas played with his eyes closed, letting the music flow through him, every note a testimony to the life he and Sarah had built, to the children they had raised, to the love that had never truly died. When the final chord faded into silence, Thomas opened his eyes to find the entire audience on their feet. In the front row, his children were clapping through their tears. Lily was jumping up and down, her usual cool demeanor forgotten in the moment. And in the third row, that empty seat seemed somehow less empty than it had before. Later that night, as the family celebrated at a small restaurant they could never have afforded before the wedding check and Maxwell's offer, Thomas found himself watching his children with a newfound sense of peace. Michael, home from college for the occasion, was teasing Emma about her college applications. Jason was excitedly telling Lily about his new telescope. They had survived. They had thrived even, and Sarah would have been so proud. As they drove home, Jason fell asleep in the back seat, his head resting against Emma's shoulder. In the rearview mirror, Thomas caught his daughter's eye. "He played your song today," Emma said softly, careful not to wake her brother. "Mom's song." Thomas nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "It's been there all along, hasn't it? The music, even when you couldn't hear it anymore." "Yes," Thomas whispered. "It was just waiting for the right moment to be heard again." When they arrived home, Thomas carried his sleeping son to bed, just as he had done when Jason was a toddler. After checking on Emma, he sat alone at the piano in the darkened living room. His fingers found the keys without thought, playing softly so as not to wake the children. It was a new melody, not Sarah's song, not the showcase piece, but something different. Something that spoke of new beginnings and unexpected second chances, of a widowed father who had gone to play at a wedding and found his way back to himself in the process. Thomas smiled as he played, imagining Sarah sitting beside him on the bench as she so often had. "You were right," he whispered to the empty room that didn't feel empty at all. "The music never really leaves us." And in homes across the city, the guests who had attended the showcase were telling their friends about the remarkable pianist they had discovered, the widowed father whose music had moved them to tears. By morning, Thomas's phone would be ringing with calls from people requesting private lessons, from local venues offering performance opportunities, from a life that was opening up in ways he could never have imagined when he sat down at that wedding piano just 1 month ago. Never judge a person's story by its beginning. Sometimes the most beautiful symphonies emerge from the deepest silence. If this story moved you, subscribe now for more powerful stories every week, and click on the video on the screen to watch the next one with a twist so powerful you'll never forget it.